Hey there, this is your flowery godmother, and this is the first video in a series that I'm calling Bake With Me. So there's not going to be a ton of instruction in these videos. This is just kind of an opportunity to hang out and bake together. Today I'm making an enriched cardamom bread that is braided or plaited, and it is flavored with cardamom and a little bit of sugar. So in the bowl first, we've put some warm milk and melted butter. And now I'm scooping in the yeast, and I'm going to let this sit for a few minutes just to make sure that the yeast is active and alive. So the milk and butter mixture is just at about maybe 96 degrees, so blood temperature. Mixing in that yeast, and I'm going to let it sit for about 5 minutes. So through the magic of video, it's now been 5 minutes, and we're going to come back. Whew, light change. And it's a little bit hard to see, but I can see that some of that yeast is blooming, so it's kind of softening and expanding, pointing out a little bit of that bloom with my scraper. And that tells me that the yeast is active and it's going to help make this dough rise well. So because this is an enriched dough, all that means is that it has the addition of kind of a relatively high ratio of fat, eggs, sugar, all things that are going to make it tender, make the gluten strands really long and kind of stringy. So if you've had challah, this bread is going to turn out looking similar to that. But again, it's going to be flavored with cardamom, and because I really enjoy cardamom with a little bit of cinnamon, I'm going to be using both of those spices today. So I'm adding the cinnamon first and then the cardamom. And this is similar to a bread that my family used to make around Christmas. My mom would usually make it maybe a week or so before Christmas and pop it in the freezer, and then Christmas morning she'd put a loaf in the oven to heat up, and we would have it with bacon and eggs. So we'd have stockings and then our Christmas bread with the rest of our breakfast before we went into present opening. So spices are in, and now we're going to start adding the eggs one at a time. And the way to make sure that eggs get thoroughly incorporated is that I like to add an egg and make sure that it's mixed in before I add the next egg. This dough is going to get a lot of mixing, so if the eggs don't get totally incorporated at this stage, I'm not too worried. So I have to tell you how much I love my bright red KitchenAid. And I don't know if you can see it at some point in this video, but the bowl that I'm mixing in is this big white bowl, and it's got green monstera leaves. And one of the things that I love besides baking is plants and growing things. Food mostly, but also some houseplants and monstera are just so fun to look at. So having them on my mixing bowl is quite a joy. So I'm adding some vanilla to the dough now. So that's got cinnamon, cardamom, vanilla, butter, milk, eggs, and a little bit of sugar. I'm just mixing that together to make sure that the eggs are incorporated. And I'm going to start adding some flour. So this is a pretty large recipe. It's about the most volume of dough that my bowl can hold, and it makes 2 very large braided loaves or 4 smaller braided loaves. And today I'm making this recipe to share with my neighbors, and so we're going to be making 4 of the smaller braided loaves. So throughout the video, you'll see me divide the dough several times in order to make those dough ropes to plait, and we'll go through the whole braiding process as well. So now just adding flour. And And I've added about 2/3 to 3/4 of the flour now. I'll mix a little bit more in as the mixer is running before I switch from the paddle mixer to the dough hook. And the dough hook is the implement that we use to do the heavy kneading work. This is a dough that we don't do any kneading by hand with. It's a soft dough and it's pretty sticky. And so this is a nice dough to let the stand mixer do the kneading on. So this dough is also really similar to a brioche dough, except that we added the butter melted in the very start. If it was kind of a more brioche type dough, there's the switch to the dough hook. If it was a more brioche type dough, we would mix all of the ingredients but the fat, and then the fat we would add in softened chunks. And so we'd throw a chunk of softened butter in, let it incorporate, throw a little more softened butter in until the dough gets really nice and sticky and long and cohesive. This is just kind of a quicker, easier way to make an enriched dough. I've also seen recipes where they ask you to cream the butter with the sugar up front and then mix in the eggs, almost like you're baking a cake. And I haven't tried that, so maybe at some point we'll try that bake instead. So I switched to the dough hook, and now I'm just adding a little bit of flour. And what I'm looking for while I'm kneading this dough to know when it has enough flour is that at the bottom of the dough, it'll be sticking to the bowl a little bit, but it'll be cleaning the sides of the bowl. And so you see that quite a bit of dough is still sticking at the bottom. So I'm probably just going to add a little more flour in there. But first, because there's so much dough, I have to lift up the head and scrape it off of the dough hook implement so it doesn't creep up and get all mixed up in my KitchenAid. A little more flour goes in there. So just a note about kneading by hand versus kneading with the KitchenAid. There are some doughs that I love to work by hand. There are some doughs that need very little kneading, like some of the sourdough bread bakes. And then there are doughs like this, the enriched doughs, where I would just rather have the KitchenAid do the work. So, matter of personal preference. If you were feeling super ambitious and you wanted to knead this all by hand, that would be totally fine. A little more scraping. So by now you've noticed too that I tend to use my hands in baking more than I use utensils. If this gives you the ick, you are welcome to grab a spoon or a spatula to scrape down your dough. One thing that I like about using my hands to do some of this work though is that I get a sense for what's happening with the dough. And I really like that because I can feel how it's changing and developing during the kneading process. So that's enough kneading with the dough hook. And now all I'm going to do is grab one of those lovely, flexible, stretchy bowl cover things. I linked to that in an earlier video, but I'll link to it again in the description down below. Can't say enough good things about these bowl covers. They're washable, they're reusable, they're adorable, and they come in multiple sizes, so I can always find one that's going to fit whatever bowl I'm using. All right, so these little woodland creatures are going to keep our dough company while it rises, and this is going to rise for an hour and a half or so. Enriched doughs have, because they have a lot of food for the yeast, they tend to rise pretty quickly. So I'm going to pull the cover off of this one and we'll take a look at how much it's risen. So that's nice. You can see I'm touching the surface of the dough and it is making an indentation, but not springing back immediately. And that is what we want to see with a yeasted dough, to know that it has had a long enough time to rise. We're proof. If it needed more time, then those indentations would be really kind of hard to see, hard to make. And if we made the indentations and they didn't fill back in, that would be overproofed. And that means that it's risen for too long and the gases are starting to collapse back in on themselves. And so what we would do in that case is that we would deflate the dough. You'll see it referred to as punching down the dough in some recipes, but really don't punch down your dough. That's just mean. You deflate it, let it rise again. It wouldn't rise as much, but you could use it again. Whereas if you go ahead and work with bread that's been overproofed, you're going to wind up with kind of a flat, disappointing bake because it already used up all of its energy overproving the first time. Okay, busted out my digital scale. I'm weighing this in grams, and what I want to get to is 4 balls of dough that are about the same size, because remember, we're making 4 loaves. So right now we just want to divide this whole chunk of dough into 4 balls that are approximately equal. So another tool that I'm using in this bake is that, what do you call it? Bench scraper, dough scraper, the wooden thing with the metal blade on it. I love that thing. You can cut dough with it. You can clean off your counter with it. If dough is sticking to a surface, you can kind of ease that blade underneath the dough and gently lift it up. It doesn't have an edge on it. It's completely dull. But it is one of my very favorite kitchen tools. And that costs like, I don't know, $8 or something. So totally worth the investment, in my opinion. And again, I've linked that digital scale in other videos, but that was one that I ordered off of Amazon. I think it cost around $12, and I'll link it again in the description below. All right, so I have my first of 4 chunks of dough here. We're going to pat it out into a kind of roughly symmetrical cylinder, and then I'm going to divide each one of these pieces of dough into 4 pieces. And so we're going to wind up with a total of 16 little balls of dough. You'll see that I'm not actually weighing these. These I just want to get close enough. I'm not terribly concerned if they're all exactly the same size. It's funny to me. It's been a while since I've made a braided loaf, and so there was some inequality in the group, and so you'll see when I braid these loaves, the first one is, as Paul Hollywood would say, a little rough and ready, and then the last 2 are the lovely plaited loaves that I kind of aim for. I gotta say though, like, it is not a big deal to me to get things identical, to get them perfect. I want bakes that taste good and bakes that I can share with people, and I want them to look nice, but I'm much, much less worried with the kind of perfection and identical nature. That's not a huge concern for me. So if that's your jam, that's awesome. You can measure these, you can weigh them, you can use rulers, whatever makes you happy. So now I'm lining my 2 baking sheets with parchment. I like to crumple up my parchment and then lay it out on the pan because I find that it winds up laying on the pan easier. So I crumple it up, open it up, and now it's not gonna like roll in on itself or try and slide off my pan or anything. So the lined pans go off to the side, and I'm gonna grab my first 4 balls of dough, and I'm just gonna roll and squeeze them into ropes, pinch them together at the top, and then braiding, I think sometimes looks more complicated than it is. If you're new to braiding, all you need to think about is over, under, over, under. And so you're going to start at one side. And once you decide which side you start on, left or right, you just always start on that side. So I'm a left to right kind of girl. So I'm going to take up the leftmost rope and take it over the second piece, under the third piece, over the last piece, and then just repeat that. So it's going to go over, under, over. Then I go back to the left, over, under, over, and then pinch those strands together at the bottom. You'll be able to see it a little bit better in later braids. Shape the braid a little bit better. Make sure everything's all pinched together, and then lift up that whole loaf and put it on the baking sheet. So this is the one that winds up looking just a little unpolished, and things improve from here. I think I actually really liked making this dough with the melted butter at the start rather than incorporating the softened butter. The dough is really soft, it's pliable, it's very easy to handle, it's not super sticky. I have hardly any flour on that surface. And the dough is just working really nicely. We do have quartz countertops, so that helps. But also this dough is just really nice. So I prepped 2 baking sheets, and I'm going to put 2 loaves on each of the baking sheets. When I bake them, I'll bake them for about half the total time and then rotate the trays. So the one that's on the top at the beginning will go to the bottom, and the one that's on the bottom will go to the top. There's the first 2 loaves. Stick them in the corner. And now we go on to loaves 3 and 4. So just a note in case you're curious, this is the speed has not been changed at all. This is the speed that I'm going at. So whether that feels fast or slow, I don't know. But I just did want to tell you that there has been no alteration of the speed. So that's a nice tidy braid. I don't mind the way that looks. Turning it around and giving it a little bit more shaping. And now we're on to the 4th and final braid. That rope was getting a little bit of a thin spot, so I flopped over the end and pinched it so that it would be a little more uniform. And then I put the ugly end at the bottom. And of course, too, if you are super comfortable with a 3-strand braid and you'd prefer to do that, that's totally fine. If you want to get fancy and make a 5-strand braid, that would be okay too. It is completely up to you. Also, I think if you were going to make 2 bigger loaves, you could have a little more opportunity to play with the number of strands in your braid. Okay, so we're going to let these loaves rise one more time. I'm going to cover them up with a towel, and they're going to sit for about an hour and a half. Surprise, it's been an hour and a half. And there are there are 3 things really that you can brush your loaves with if you want a specific kind of finish. And then different combinations of things. So you could brush them with water, you could brush them with egg, you could brush them with milk or cream. And each one gives a slightly different finish. What I want the finish on these loaves to be is to be kind of soft, not a high sheen or gloss. And I also am going to put some pearl sugar on these when I bake them. And so I want something that is going to allow the pearl sugar to stick to it. So I'm using a little bit of whole milk, and just a silicone brush to coat these loaves. Then I'm going to sprinkle them all with that Swedish pearl sugar and pop them into the oven. The oven's been preheating for about 30 minutes. So as soon as I get these coated and topped with sugar, they'll go into the oven. So the original recipe called for making this dough into 2 large loaves. And so the length of time that they tell you to bake the loaves for is for larger loaves. Since these are smaller loaves, you can adjust your baking time. And so you just kind of want to keep an eye on it and start checking it at about 10 minutes shorter than you would for the 2 larger loaves. It's not going to make a huge amount of difference in the amount of time that you bake it, but it will make some difference. And if you overbake these loaves, they're going to be a little bit dry. They're going to lose some of that nice long fiber texture. So overbaking, not great. I think we found these silicone brushes. It's like one is a brush and the other is a little spatula at like a discount grocery store where I live, and they're super handy. There's one out by the barbecue. There's one here in the kitchen. I love them. Okay, got the Swedish pearl sugar out of the cupboard, and now I am sprinkling. As I've mentioned previously, sometimes specialty grocery items are a little bit hard to find where I live. So I also wound up ordering this pearl sugar online. And it's delightful. Okay, and now these loaves are ready to go in the oven. So the next thing you'll see is them coming out of the oven. It's the big reveal. They're in for about 35 minutes. And we've got some beautifully browned, slightly shiny, soft-topped breads with that cute little pop of Swedish pearl sugar. Flipping over the bottom, it's nice. Dough surface is pretty soft. The braids turned out really pretty, and you can just kind of rip a hunk off and see how nice and stretchy that is. Soft and delicious. All right. Thanks so much for baking with me today. Take care.